Can you believe that a gentle, sun-kissed land, the very heart of Renaissance Italy, could hold a secret so terrifying, so brutal, it would make the Black Death look like a pleasant spring shower? This is not the Italy of magnificent frescoes and sprawling vineyards. This is a shadow realm, a jagged spine of unforgiving stone known as the Apennines, circa 1400 CE. We are talking about true, absolute, horrifying isolation, where the only thing louder than human screaming was the wind itself, a wind that carried the metallic scent of death and impending ice. The calendar read late September, the time for celebration and abundant harvest. But the air felt poisoned, tasting suddenly of iron and distant granite. Something ancient and malicious had stirred in the frozen northern reaches of the continent. A vast, invisible ice leviathan slithering down the European landmass, and its icy breath was aimed squarely at these remote mountain hamlets. A catastrophe no one saw coming, not because they were blind, but because their history books refused to believe the mountains could truly betray them like this. They called it simply Il Respiro, the breath of the mountain. And when it arrived, it didn't whisper, it roared. The first sign wasn't snow, it was the sound. A low, grinding moan that echoed off the sheer cliffs, a noise that spoke of metal tearing and colossal atmospheric pressure building up miles above the highest peak. The farmers, hardened men who had seen every storm imaginable, stopped dead in the fields, the pitchforks falling from their numb hands. Their dogs whined and ran for cover, sensing the impending doom long before the human mind could rationalize the cosmic shift underway. In the tiny, precarious village of Pietra, clinging to the mountainside like a desperate lichen, life was built on ritual and predictable seasons. Their world was small, perhaps 30 families, bound by blood, rock, and the shared, precarious struggle for altitude. They had survived war, famine, and even the recent plague, relying on their deep stone houses and the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. But all that tradition was about to be obliterated by a force that defied all known memory, a relentless punishment delivered straight from the heavens. The temperature plunged 20 degrees in a single terrifying afternoon. Imagine this, the sun still bright, high in the sky, yet the air was instantly bone-shattering, tasting of iron and distant icebergs. The water buckets outside froze solid in the middle of the day, exploding the wooden staves with startling cracks. This was not normal winter. This was a geological insult, a sudden, violent revocation of the life-giving warmth they depended on. It was as if the very laws of physics had been momentarily suspended, just to punish this specific corner of the world, magnifying the cold 10 times over. Panic spread faster than wildfire. The late crops, the last chance for survival, the final stores of winter squash and hardy vegetables were instantly flash-frozen into useless, brittle statues of green, their inner moisture crystallized into deadly shards. The precious few animals still grazing higher up, primarily sheep and goats, were trapped, unable to navigate the sudden, treacherous sheets of black ice coating the mountain passes. Every single source of immediate sustenance, the very thin line between survival and starvation, was severed in less than 2 hours. Look into the eyes of Mayor Alessandro, the man responsible for Pietra. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was terrified of failing the legacy of his forefathers. He stood on the village square, staring up at the peaks that were now suddenly shrouded in a dark, ominous purple haze, feeling the weight of 300 souls pressing down on his shoulders. He knew in his gut, a sickening primal certainty, that this was not a storm that would pass in 3 days. This was the end of their world, measured not in fire, but in absolute, unrelenting, agonizing cold. The first desperate act began immediately, securing wood. But the mountains were always stingy, and while they had enough for a mild winter, they certainly didn't have enough for this level of catastrophic freezing. The younger men, fueled by adrenaline and a primal fear for their families, began fighting over the stored piles, tearing at each other's clothing, and screaming threats that broke the sacred centuries-old mountain silence. The cold wasn't just killing the crops, it was killing the community spirit, turning neighbor against neighbor within hours of its arrival, stripping away the veneer of civilization with terrifying speed. And then came the final, devastating move by the atmospheric monster. Not heavy, insulating snow, but a relentless, needle-sharp sleet that coated the winding, narrow mountain paths leading down to the valley markets. This wasn't just ice. This was glacial armor, making the routes instantly impassable for man or beast, trapping Pietra completely. Their lifeline to the outside world, the last chance to trade for grains and supplies before true, deep winter set in, was brutally severed. They were now sealed off, suspended between the unforgiving rock and the encroaching, hungry ice, a forgotten island in a sea of frozen despair. They estimated they had perhaps enough preserved food for 4 weeks, maybe 6 if they starved themselves immediately and ate only half rations. But the cold demanded calories, demanding constant fuel just to keep the heart beating against the invading frost. Every breath exhaled was a desperate cloud, a visible manifestation of their rapidly dwindling life force. The children huddled closer to the dying embers, their eyes wide and reflecting the terrifying knowledge that they might not see the spring sun ever again. A tragedy brewing in their small, trembling chests. Elder Marco, the village historian whose memory spanned nearly a century, spoke in a trembling voice of the legends, tales usually dismissed as drunken ramblings. He spoke of the year the gods turned away, a time centuries prior, when the mountains devoured entire villages whole, leaving behind only frozen, silent monuments to human desperation. Was this that year returned to claim its due? Was this the prophesied cold cycle, far worse than any meteorologist or priest could possibly comprehend? The sheer scale of the terror was drowning out common sense and reason. It wasn't the old or the weak who broke first. It was young Giacomo, the strongest woodcutter, who simply sat down outside his door, refusing the warmth offered by his frantic wife. He looked at the sky and whispered that the world had ended, and there was no point in fighting a dead god. He was pulled inside, weeping hysterically, the first psychological casualty, demonstrating that the real war would be fought not against the cold air, but against the chilling grip of absolute hopelessness that was tightening around their isolated world. This is the epic, heartbreaking tale of Pietra, a place forgotten by time, now facing an enemy more relentless and unforgiving than any army: the brutal, exaggerated climate of the Apennine Mountains in the 15th century. They have 4 weeks of food, but perhaps only 4 days of true, collective courage left before the inevitable breakdown. The question isn't whether they can survive the winter. The question is what monstrous acts they will commit just to see tomorrow's agonizingly cold sunrise. And trust me, what happened next is something you simply won't believe. The sun didn't just rise that morning. It was hauled above the jagged peaks like a cold copper coin, offering absolutely no warmth, only light enough for the villagers of Rocca Silente to see the horrifying math laid out before them. They had gambled on a normal winter, believing the traditional wisdom of their ancestors would hold true. But this wasn't winter. This was the earth itself holding its breath, freezing the very lungs of the world into crystalline shards of ice. Old man Matteo, the village Masato, the elected steward and leader, stared at the grain stores, his hands trembling not just from the bone-deep cold, but from the realization that gripped his soul like a frostbite vice. 2 months of rations, maybe 3 if they went down to starvation levels that would leave them too weak to fight the cold, against what looked like 6 months of unnatural geological horror that had descended without warning. The wind, that omnipresent, shrieking beast, had not subsided. It only intensified its psychological torture, howling promises of death through the narrow stone streets and down the soot-stained chimneys, eroding the last vestiges of civilized thought and drowning out the cries of the feverish children. Matteo knew the truth. The disaster wasn't the cold itself, but the speed at which their resources, the fragile infrastructure of their 15th century mountain life, were being consumed by this monstrous atmospheric anomaly. The stone walls of their homes, which had stood for centuries, were now merely porous shields against a cold that seemed to seep through solid rock. But grain was only half the equation. The other half was heat. And heat in the Apennines in 1400 CE meant carefully stacked, precious, life-giving wood, seasoned for years in preparation for the annual chill. When the young, desperate laborers were sent to the outer sheds, the air thick with fear and the smell of fear, they found something even more terrifying than the cold: systematic pilfering. Not by raiders from the next valley. The blizzard was too thick for any outsider to survive the journey. But by insiders. Someone, or some family, had decided that their survival was more important than the community's, quietly dragging away entire stacks of precious chestnut logs and bundles of kindling, while the rest of the village huddled, praying and crying in terror. This was the moment the social contract didn't just bend under pressure, it shattered into a million icy shards, signifying that the invisible, unspoken war for resources had already begun, fought not with swords, but with silent, terrifying betrayals under the cover of the killing wind. Suspicion became the village currency, weighted heavily with paranoia. Every shadowed look, every hurried retreat into a private dwelling, every whispered conversation behind a frozen hand was catalogued and judged by neighbors who were rapidly transforming into rivals. The simple communal act of boiling water for thin broth became a spectacle of perceived greed, watched by hungry, desperate eyes. Families started barricading their homes, not against the phantom wolves that stalked the higher slopes, but against their own kind, sliding heavy iron bolts across splintered wooden doors, ensuring that their meager, flickering firelight and the faint warmth it offered was theirs and theirs alone. Matteo knew that if he didn't act immediately, the order he had maintained for 30 years, the delicate balance between harsh life and necessary cooperation, would dissolve into a cannibalistic free-for-all before the next deadly snowfall even hit. He had to draw a line, etched in the glacial sand of their impending doom, a line of blood and fire. His solution was brutal, instantaneous, and necessary if they were to survive the next week, let alone the entire winter. Gathering the remaining men, those not too sick or too old to stand, in the cold, shadowed church hall, the only place large enough where the collective panic could be momentarily contained, he announced the iron law of Rocca Silente. No family was allowed to keep more than a day's worth of cooked food in their possession, effectively ending private stores and hoarding. All reserves were centralized and rationed strictly by the Massaro and 3 trusted, heavily armed guards wielding axes and rusty hunting spears. This immediate seizure of private necessary resources was met first with stunned silence, then a low, dangerous murmur that promised immediate insurrection and the shedding of blood. The second part of the Iron Law was even more terrifying, aimed directly at stopping the fuel theft that had accelerated the community's demise. If you are caught hoarding or hiding any resource, or if you interfere with the official rationing, you will spend the night outside the wall. In this environment, spending the night outside the relative shelter of the village wall was not merely punishment, it was a non-negotiable death sentence delivered by the wind itself, a quick, agonizing death by freezing that required no physical executioner. It was a gamble, sacrificing freedom for security, and Matteo knew it would cost lives. But Rocca Silente was only one agonizing node in this mountain chain nightmare. News, usually slow and unreliable even in the mildest seasons, had ceased entirely. The paths were choked with unnatural drifts that stood taller than a man on horseback, and the passes were sealed shut by ice that looked older than the mountains themselves, gleaming malevolently in the pale light. The isolation was absolute, a prison of stone and ice. Yet whispers traveled faster than any messenger, carried on the very wind that sought to kill them. Whispers of what was happening in the village of Pietra Nera, 10 miles further up the spine of the Apennines, a village known for its stubborn self-sufficiency and its harsh, unforgiving character. Pietra Nera, a smaller, even more desperate community, had already crossed the Rubicon of human decency, abandoning Matteo's tentative attempts at order. The tale, told in hushed tones around the dying embers of the communal fire, concerned their livestock, the few precious goats and pigs they depended on, not just for food, but for future wealth. When the animals began to die of the cold, despite the villagers' desperate efforts, they weren't just butchered for meat. They were brought inside the homes, alive, to share their body heat, fouling the air and spreading inevitable pestilence, but buying the desperate inhabitants a few more hours of precious, agonizing warmth against the onslaught. But the true horror, the monstrous act that defined the new, dark age of the Apennines, came when the meat ran out, and the children began to cry. The high, thin sound of their hunger echoing through the stone streets like a mournful prophecy that could no longer be ignored. The whispers said that Pietra Nera, having consumed every animal, every scrap of leather, and every last root they could dig from the frozen ground, had turned their gaze toward the weakest among them, those already sick or too elderly to contribute, invoking a forgotten, barbaric tradition of necessity to ensure the survival of the young. And this was only the start of the 3rd week of the great, unnatural winter. The mountain had begun to feed upon itself, and the nightmare had only just begun. The choice was simple, brutal, and made in the pitch dark of the mountain night. Burn the last doorframe, or let the children freeze to death before dawn. The cold had ceased to be mere weather. It was a geological force, a crushing, silent entity that leached the heat from bone marrow and turned every breath into a needle of searing ice. The village of Castelluccio, once known for its vibrant harvest festivals, now smelled overwhelmingly of burning furniture, and worse, burning history. They had exhausted the outer sheds, the dead trees, and the low-grade coal scavenged weeks ago from the old, abandoned mine shafts. The terrifying reality was that every flicker of warmth consumed a piece of their remaining shelter, accelerating their final, inevitable doom. The fuel crisis had officially superseded the food crisis. Because what good was half a crust of bread if your body temperature was already plummeting toward the point of no return? The heavy, unnatural snowfall, a phenomenon local priests whispered was the earth rejecting man for some forgotten sin, had completely severed all ties to the outside world. Paths that once took a few hours to traverse were now impassable, treacherous valleys of compacted ice, dozens of feet deep, making any attempt at communication a guaranteed, suicidal death sentence. The great brass bells of neighboring Pietraferrata, which had traditionally rung every noon to signal the passage of time and the continuity of faith, had fallen silent 5 days ago. This was not just a loss of contact. It was the chilling, psychological terror of witnessing the map of their known world shrink and disappear, leaving them as the last isolated island in a colossal, white, frozen sea of oblivion. Father Matteo, his hands cracked and bleeding from handling ice rather than holy water, stood before the skeletal, shivering remains of his congregation. His sermons, once booming with the promise of divine salvation, were now thin, reedy pleas, utterly unable to compete with the deep, gnawing hunger and the cold that drove the desperate to silence the weak for the sake of resources. The social contract, the very fabric of mountain life, built upon generations of interdependence, was dissolving faster than the candle wax they were desperately trying to conserve by shielding it in their icy palms. Every remaining sack of cured meat, every hoarded bottle of precious olive oil, which was now worth more than gold and certainly more than a human life, became an immediate, lethal point of internal conflict, decided not by law, but by pure, brute strength. The animals, the livestock they had depended upon for centuries, had either already been consumed or had simply succumbed to the paralyzing cold, their frozen corpses too contaminated or too inaccessible to retrieve safely from the drifts. The hunters of Castelluccio were no longer looking for wild boar or deer. They were looking for anything that held residual warmth, a truly horrific sign of their absolute destitution. They turned, finally, to the high, dark recesses of the stone barns and the damp cellars, hunting the rats and mice that had once been reviled pests, now elevated to necessary, though utterly repulsive, sources of protein. A single frozen bird found beneath the collapsed eaves was treated like a king's ransom, fought over with sharpened tools and primal fury. The hunger was not just physical, it was corrosive, stripping away the thin, fragile veneer of civilized restraint that centuries had built up in these isolated valleys, revealing the savage core beneath. But the most terrifying element was the ceaseless wind. It was no longer a meteorological pattern. It was the grinding sound of the Apennines tearing themselves apart, a deep, unsettling groan that felt fundamentally wrong, unnatural, and ancient. When the wind hit the valley floor, it carried not just snow, but fine granular ice mixed with pulverized dust, suggesting the storm was physically eroding the very bedrock of the mountain itself, an echo of some forgotten primeval catastrophe. This perpetual howling sound, a subsonic moan that vibrated through the foundation stones of their homes, shattered all hope of restful sleep and systematically eroded their collective sanity. It was the sound of the world ending, not in fire and brimstone, but in an agonizing, excruciating, prolonged freeze. And the villagers were trapped, utterly helpless, in the middle of a geological scream. The reserves of stored grain, primarily hard wheat and barley, were now rationed to a single handful per day for the strongest workers, leaving the elderly and infants to subsist on thin, watery broth made solely from melted snow. Scurvy began its silent, insidious march through the village, a cruel secondary executioner, arriving just when they thought the cold was the worst enemy they faced, causing bleeding gums and systemic collapse. There was no effective remedy for the rampant coughs and fevers that accompanied this deep freeze, illnesses triggered by the constant sub-zero dampness. The traditional herbal remedies stored dry in linen sacks were long gone, either consumed or inadvertently burned for a fleeting moment of warmth. Without medicine, a simple cold was now a death sentence, swiftly claiming those who were already weakened and providing a terrifying indicator of who would fall next. The mothers, guided by an instinct more ancient than any fragile civilization, clustered the remaining children in the warmest, most central house, the old mill, whose thick stone walls offered marginal protection. They surrounded the children with their own bodies, creating a desperate, living heat shield, sacrificing their own meager caloric intake to guarantee the survival of the species, if only for one more day. But even this collective effort was weakening, their own resources dwindling rapidly. The unspoken, horrifying question hanging in the frigid air was not if they would survive the winter, but who they would have to sacrifice next to guarantee the survival of the few. Was officially extinct. The mountains had claimed their prey, and they were beginning to chew. The mountains were not just chewing now, they were digesting. The fourth week began with the visceral realization that the cold was not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberate, sentient entity pressing down on the stone huts, squeezing the air from their lungs and the hope from their hearts. Old Silvio, the village patriarch, finally shattered, his screams echoing off the frozen walls as he demanded the sun return, his voice cracking like ice on a pond. 4 weeks of this suffocating white purgatory had stripped away civilization, leaving only the ragged, desperate core of survival. They had moved far past the simple act of rationing. They were now in the deep, dangerous territory of delusion, haunted by ghost memories of summer markets, of fresh, warm bread, and the sweet, dizzying comfort of wine. These dreams tormented their sleep, only to smash against the unbearable waking reality of thin, bitter gruel and air that felt like fine, crushed glass when inhaled. The children, those tiny, once vibrant voices, were unnervingly silent now, their wide eyes tracking the slow, agonizing disintegration of their parents into desperate, primal shapes. They saw the end coming, even if the adults refused to name the horror. Il Tagliatore, the cutter, the name they had given the wind, had not lessened its fury, it had magnified it, driving the temperature to depths so far below zero that simply touching metal was an act of instant, surgical self-mutilation. Time ceased to be a measure of days and reverted to heartbeats, the sheer, agonizing effort required to pull the next breath. Then, the next stage of the nightmare arrived, carried not by the wind, but by the breath of the strongest man, Marco the hunter. It started with a cough, a wet, rattling sound pulled from the deepest recesses of the chest, ending with a terrifying spray of dark arterial blood, staining the pristine white snow floor inside his hut. The isolation, initially a curse of resource deprivation, instantly transformed into a deadly biological incubator. They were sealed in with death itself. The new disease tore through the small, weakened population with a speed that defied logic. They whispered the name Il Fuoco Bianco, the white fire, because it burned the victim from the inside out, turning their skin ash gray and their eyes black and sunken, even as the external world froze around them. This was not just famine. This was the complete biological betrayal of the human body. Marco's death brought forth a problem more immediate and terrifying than hunger. How do you honor the dead when the ground is frozen solid down to the bedrock? Their tools snapped like brittle twigs against the geological armor of the earth. The men, weakened by hunger and fear, soon stopped trying. The terrible, unspoken realization dawned upon the survivors. They would have to live alongside their dead. The concept of communal sharing, the ancient bedrock of mountain life, evaporated like water in a furnace. Trust became the most dangerous liability. Every single frozen scrap of potato, every sliver of saved wood, every half cup of icy water became a zero-sum game, a currency worth more than gold and secured with desperate, murderous intent. The village council, the formal structure of their society, dissolved into pathetic, paranoid squabbling. Old scores, buried beneath decades of shared hardship and uneasy peace, resurrected themselves with brutal clarity. Who had more stored grain? Whose family was hoarding the last precious lumps of salt? Whispers quickly escalated to shouts, and shouts soon gave way to the terrifying, muffled sound of primal combat in the gloom surrounding the central, sputtering fire pit. The true villain was no longer the indifferent mountain, but the starving reflection of one's own fear seen in the eyes of their neighbor, a constant, threatening amplification of their consuming hunger. Children were no longer just shielded from the wind. They were shielded from the horrifying sight of their fathers glaring, calculatingly, at the diminishing shadows cast by their neighbors. The final remaining resource was fuel. They had long since burned through every stack of logs, every piece of furniture, and even the family heirlooms. Old wooden carvings passed down for generations were now sacrificed to the insatiable god of warmth. Now, with a horrifying, calculated intent, they turned their gazes upon the very structures that kept the wind at bay, their homes. The first hut to be sacrificed was the one belonging to the family entirely consumed by the white fire. It was a silent, grim process of dismantlement. Men climbed onto the frozen roof, tearing away the wooden shingles, pulling out the load-bearing beams, a desperate gamble that the entire structure would not collapse before they secured the necessary fuel for one night's survival. The fire that night was a temporary, glorious, blinding victory over the endless dark. But it was agonizingly fleeting, and the cost was catastrophic. They had just tacitly agreed that their continued existence depended entirely upon the systematic destruction of their own shelter. They were eating their own walls, burning their foundation, just to keep their hands from freezing off for a few more hours.
Father Tommaso, the youngest priest, was the last man clinging to the ideal of hope, convinced that if they could only clear the path to the signal point on the ridge, God would see them. It was undeniably a suicide mission. The snow drifts were monumental, unnatural sculptures of compressed ice, taller than any man, carved by il tagliatore into razor-sharp, lethal ridges.
He took 2 others, men too exhausted to argue, offering them the only true luxury remaining, a reason to die with dignity. They were gone for half a day. When Father Tommaso returned, crawling on hands and knees, his eyes were no longer those of a faithful priest, but of a broken prophet who had stared into the face of utter, cosmic indifference. He said nothing of his companions. He only dropped the object he carried onto the bloody snow, a frozen, heavy chunk of metal, the bell clapper, violently ripped from its moorings by the unending wind. The mountains had not just stolen their resources, they had stolen the voice of the church, silencing their prayers. The psychological siege was complete. The Apennines had claimed not just their bodies, but their souls, piece by agonizing piece. And the 5th week was now drawing its first deadly cold breath. The 5th week arrived, not with a roar of the dreadful wind, but with a creeping, soundless chill that was somehow far worse than the noise. The villagers of Roccafredda looked at the dwindling embers, realizing that their carefully hoarded woodpiles were now functionally useless against this monstrous atmospheric phenomenon. They were trapped in stone coffins, built to withstand normal storms, but fundamentally failing against the true geological malice gripping the mountain spine. The communal grain silo, the pride of the village reeve, was officially empty. Not just low, empty. What little dried meat remained was so riddled with salt and age that chewing it felt like eating leather dipped in sand. Mothers began making impossible calculations, weighing the life of an older, ailing relative against the caloric needs of a small, fragile child who still had a chance at survival. The old code of mountain honor, the unbreakable pact of shared suffering, was dissolving faster than frost on a summer morning. The eyes of neighbors no longer held sympathy. They held measurements, calculating how much energy you possessed, and how long until that energy became a viable resource for them. This was the true horror. The cold had stripped away the thin veneer of civilization, leaving only the primal, starving beast underneath, lurking in the shadows of the flickering oil lamps. The terrifying silence was punctuated only by the dry, rasping coughs of the victims, their lungs already surrendered to the icy grip. Medieval construction methods, usually robust protectors against the Apennine winters, became weapons of mass destruction. These homes were thick-walled, built of rough-hewn stone intended for thermal mass, but that very mass had turned into a gigantic, freezing sponge. The walls were leaching heat from the air faster than a brazier could generate it. Every breath condensed instantly, clinging to the rafters like a million tiny daggers of ice. And the smoke from the indoor fires, which now burned only twigs and old furniture, was becoming a fatal poison in itself. Nobody dared open the heavy, shuttered windows, knowing that a single blast of the outer cold would instantly shatter the brittle glass and drop the indoor temperature to lethal levels in seconds. The villagers were suffocating slowly in the smoke or freezing quickly in the draft. It was a choice between two agonizing, airless deaths. Then came the famine sickness. It began subtly, bleeding gums, purple spots appearing on the skin where no injury had occurred, and an unbearable, throbbing pain in the joints. Their bodies, starved of nutrients, were beginning to physically fall apart. This wasn't just starvation. This was a complete systemic failure. Scurvy, or the mal di chiaccio, as the terrified few who still had the strength to whisper called it, was turning their robust peasant frames into fragile internal ruin. Priests whispered about divine retribution, but the terrible truth was simply the absence of fresh food, the complete obliteration of viable crops, and the lack of any vitamin C source for 5 straight weeks. They looked less like living people and more like walking, bruised ghosts, their muscles atrophied, their once strong limbs refusing to obey the commands of their desperate minds. The local militia, usually the backbone of mountain law, had practically disbanded. Their loyalty was now owed only to their own freezing stomachs and their feverish children. Discipline vanished like a drop of water on a hot stone. A desperate scramble began for the last remaining stores in the cellar of the defunct mayor's house, a place rumored to still hold some forgotten jars of preserved olives. The resulting skirmish was brief, brutal, and utterly silent. It wasn't the sound of fighting that echoed in the tunnels between the houses. It was the sound of tearing cloth and the sickening, wet thud of bone against stone. No prayers were offered, no quarter given. Just the stark, brutal calculus of survival played out in the unforgiving dark. The true battle was no longer against the wind, but against the person standing closest to you. Trust was gone. Love was a foolish memory. Only the cold, sharp edge of necessity remained. And yet, the mountain held other horrors. The wolves, driven insane by the same starvation that gripped the humans, were growing bolder. Their howls, once distant echoes, were now terrifyingly close. circling the villages, recognizing the weakness, sensing the scent of the dying. These were not merely scavenging animals. They were desperate hunters, massive shadows emboldened by the sheer magnitude of the disaster, viewing the weakened human inhabitants as just another slow-moving prey resource. But some whispered that the wolves were not the worst threat. Rumors, carried on the frozen breath of those who dared venture out, spoke of figures wrapped in dark, heavy cloaks, moving silently along the higher passes. These were not villagers. These were not friends. They were the scavengers of the lowlands, bandits and opportunists, who understood that disaster created a vacuum of power and wealth, even if that wealth was only a handful of dried beans. The fifth week promised not just death by freezing, but death by the hand of man, or the tooth of the beast. The mountain was closing in, and its inhabitants were realizing, with bone-jarring clarity, that they were utterly and irrevocably alone, locked into a frozen nightmare with only their dwindling madness for company. The final siege had begun, and no one was coming to lift it. The realization of loneliness was swiftly replaced by a far more immediate terror, the slow, inevitable death by arithmetic. Every flicker of the fire, every shared bite of rancid cured meat, was a calculation against the infinite, howling void outside. This was not merely winter. This was a geological insult, a siege laid by the very bones of the mountain, demanding tribute in flesh and sanity. The deep, dark woods that once provided comfort and fuel were now impenetrable mausoleums of ice, their branches snapping like the femurs of giants under the relentless, crushing weight of the unnatural cold. The villagers of Castelfranco, huddled in their stone crypts, began to count, not days, but heartbeats, until the final cold claimed them. The communal stores, once a source of civic pride and stability, had dwindled to dust and memory, a cruel joke played by the mountain gods. Grain reserves had been consumed weeks ago, and now the desperate search turned to the unspeakable, the things that were never meant to be food. They gnawed on leather straps, boiled until they yielded a miserable, greasy broth, and scoured the freezing rafters for any sign of rodent life, which had, with unnerving foresight, seemingly vanished into the bedrock, abandoning the doomed humans to their fate. Paranoia became the new currency. In the close confines of the remaining active cellars, where 20 souls breathed the same exhausted air, every glance was an accusation, every shadow a potential threat, concealing a stolen crust of hardened bread or a splinter of precious kindling. Old Marco, known for his pious devotion just months before, began sleeping with a rusty scythe laid across his chest, his eyes darting wildly toward the children sleeping closest to the meager sacks of dried beans. The cold had stripped away the thin, fragile veneer of civilization, peeling back the layers of societal contract to reveal the primal, predatory core beneath, demanding that only the fittest, most ruthless minds survive this impossible test. The most chilling realization was the cost of mere existence. To keep one furnace roaring for a single night required the wood equivalent of a year's normal, moderate harvest, a resource that simply did not exist in this frozen hellscape. And there were mouths that consumed heat and sustenance, but contributed nothing to the brutal labor of maintaining the fragile illusion of warmth. The weak, the sick, and the very old. The weak began to disappear with a terrifying regularity. Not quickly, not dramatically, but through a silent, unspoken consensus born of absolute terror and cold, immutable logic. The elderly, already frail, would be found stiffened in the morning, their allocated blanket having mysteriously migrated to a younger, stronger body during the few hours of fitful, gasping sleep. No one spoke of it. The silence surrounding these sudden, convenient deaths was louder than the howling wind itself, a shrieking testament to the fact that God's mercy had been replaced by the merciless, indifferent laws of supply and demand, and that survival demanded unforgivable sacrifices. Sleep offered no respite. It was merely a descent into shivering nightmares fueled by hunger and the stench of unwashed bodies. They began to see things in the perpetual gloom and the flickering, weak light of the dwindling fires. Flickering shadows that weren't the firelight, whispers that weren't the wind, ghostly apparitions weaving through the frost-rimmed corners of the cellar. Giovanni, the village carpenter, swore he saw the mountain breathing, its enormous, icy chest rising and falling just beyond the jagged, menacing outline of the frozen ridge. He claimed the cold was not just air, not just a storm, but a living, colossal beast, deliberately inhaling the heat from their bodies, sucking the very warmth from their blood. He would stand watch by the single, reinforced door, hacking furiously at the empty air with his axe, trying to drive back the unseen, ethereal entity that he believed was draining their last reserves of vitality, shouting desperate warnings that were quickly muffled by the overwhelming, deadening roar of the gale. He was not mad, the others decided. He was simply seeing the truth more clearly than they dared. Water, the most basic element of life, became a source of agonizing labor and subsequent sickness. Surrounded by endless crystalline ice and drifts of frozen snow, they were ironically dying of thirst, their throats raw and cracked. Melting the ice required fuel, and fuel was literally life itself. The choice was agonizing and repeated hourly. Burn wood to drink, or save the wood to live another hour, risking the fever and delirium that came from extreme dehydration. Dysentery began to snake through the huddled groups, a vile, invisible predator, exploiting their weakened state with ruthless efficiency. The constant need for waste disposal in the confined, crowded spaces became an unbearable logistical nightmare, forcing risky excursions into the lethal exterior, where the cold instantly crystallized moisture and breath alike, turning the act of relieving oneself into a potentially fatal gamble. This secondary siege, the siege of disease, was a subtle, persistent horror, targeting the children and the malnourished with surgical precision, ensuring that fewer mouths would survive to face the next inevitable frozen week. The desperate, fading hope for a rescue party, a beacon from the world beyond the mountains, finally extinguished itself like a damp candle wick. They had listened for the sound of bells, the distant horn of a passing soldier, anything that suggested civilization still existed, that someone remembered the tiny dots of life clinging to the Apennine spine. Nothing. Only the omnipresent, deafening, metallic snarl of the elemental wind. They realized that the mountain pass wasn't just blocked, it had been utterly and completely erased. The entire region was a temporary, horrific anomaly, a pocket of human suffering neatly excised from the map of 15th century Italy by a geological knife. They were the damned, the forgotten souls of the medieval world. The cold king had claimed his territory, and the last surviving embers of communal decency and Christian charity were rapidly freezing over. The final, brutal stage of this horrifying natural experiment was now underway. The ultimate test of how long human flesh could resist the inevitable crystallization of despair and the absolute, consuming void of the ultimate cold. The ultimate cold was not just a killer. It was an alchemist of the soul, transmuting every noble instinct into the raw, desperate metal of immediate survival. The experiment was progressing rapidly, and the data was horrifying. When the veneer of civilization is scraped away by the fingernails of starvation and frostbite, what remains is utterly unrecognizable, a primal shape howling into the white void. The people of Colle d'Asino, nestled precariously below the looming icy spire of Montevettore, had finally finished their terrible arithmetic. They had counted the dwindling sacks of farro, weighed the last cuts of cured boar fat, and tallied the number of living souls, and the ledger screamed the same irreversible truth. They had 2 weeks of sustenance remaining, perhaps 3, if they were willing to let the youngest children begin to fade first. That was the new currency of the Apennines, not gold or silver, but the finite number of days left before the stomach became a cavern of agony, and the body simply surrendered its heat. This terrible realization hung in the air, heavier than the ice fog that permanently obscured the valley floor. It choked the prayer of the priest and silenced the cries of the hungry infant. It was the great silence, the sound of an entire community holding its breath, waiting for the only logical conclusion to whisper its dreadful command: go out and take what you need. Isolation, the very thing that had protected these mountain villages for centuries, had now become the absolute guarantor of their doom. The roads were not merely blocked by snow, they were barricaded by geological malice, sheer cliffs of compacted ice and winds that could strip the flesh from bone in a matter of minutes. Yet the elders knew, deep in the frozen marrow of their fear, that somewhere, perhaps in the rival village of Poggio Mezzanotte, clinging to the northern slope, there might still be something left. There might be a miscalculation, a forgotten store, a single cache of grain that could grant them another week of life. It was a suicidal hope. It was a prayer whispered to the devil, but in the realm of the ultimate cold, the devil was the only god still listening. The village selected its raiders, not the strongest, for true strength was now irrelevant, but the most expendable, the men whose deaths would cause the least disruption to the desperate, dwindling gene pool. These were the ghosts of Colledasino, wrapped in every scrap of linen and wool they owned, their faces obscured by scarves, frozen stiff with exhaled breath, carrying axes meant for wood, now repurposed for the ultimate transgression. Their mission was simple, brutal, and essential. Move like shadows through the frozen hellscape, traverse the 4 miles of impossible terrain, and return with anything that had calories, regardless of the cost in blood or conscience. The journey itself was a descent into a mythological underworld. The familiar trails were gone, erased by drifting snow and sheets of glazed ice that acted like massive, treacherous mirrors, reflecting the pale, indifferent sun back into the heavens. Every step was a calculation of imminent death. The wind, which they had long ago personified as the mountain scourge, no longer blew randomly. It seemed intelligent, probing their weak points, seeking the slightest gap in their clothing, driving ice shards into exposed skin like miniature, furious arrows. They moved in single file, tied together by a frayed hemp rope, knowing that if one fell into a hidden crevasse, a gaping wound in the earth caused by the unnatural cold snapping the bedrock, the others would have to cut the line and abandon him. There were no rescues in this new world. They walked past the husks of trees, skeletal sentinels standing guard over the silent massacre, and eventually, through the blinding white, they saw the faintest sign of Poggio Mezzanotte. It was not the scent of wood smoke or the sound of distant dogs that betrayed its presence. It was the sudden, overwhelming stench of fear and unwashed desperation, a smell that traveled farther than any sound in the paralyzing cold. They approached the outer wall, not with the fanfare of war, but with the slinking stealth of starved wolves. They found the village eerily quiet, the silence more unsettling than any shout of alarm. The truth dawned on them even before they kicked open the door to the small, fortified storage building. Poggio Mezzanotte was not hoarding resources. It was already dying. Their population was halved, reduced to shivering, hollow-eyed relics clustered around a single, failing fire in the main square. The fire was fueled not by wood, but by furniture, slowly consuming the village itself. And yet, there it was, a single, pitiful stack of grain sacks, perhaps enough to sustain 10 people for a week. It was guarded not by armed men, but by a lone, gaunt old woman, clutching a broken pitchfork, her eyes wide with the absolute terror of a creature defending its last scrap of life. The confrontation was not a battle of heroes. It was a pathetic, gasping struggle over a few kilograms of moldy sustenance. The tragedy was in the quick, silent efficiency of the act. There were no impassioned pleas, no desperate bargains, only the dull thud of the pitchfork hitting the packed snow, the rasping breath of the raiders, and the heavy, sickening slide of grain sacks onto the sleds. The ghosts of Kalidasino had committed the unforgivable sin, not for triumph, but for the miserable postponement of their own destruction. They had killed hope in another village, just to buy 2 more weeks of freezing agony for their own. As they retreated, dragging their shameful bounty back into the enveloping storm, the men did not speak. They knew that the cold had done more than just freeze the water in the soil. It had frozen the very foundation of their morality. They were no longer neighbors or men of God. They were merely biological machines, driven by the singular, unyielding imperative of heat retention and caloric input. The ultimate test continued, and the results were conclusive. When pitted against the absolute void, the human spirit was not indomitable. It was merely brittle, shattering into sharp, dangerous shards that could wound anyone who dared to get close. The shattered spirit meant the end of names. They were no longer Lorenzo the baker or Sophia the weaver. They were merely units of heat exchange, bundles of caloric potential waiting to be expended, or worse, seized by the growing desperation that now ruled the high passes. The wind, which had once been a physical barrier, now became a psychological executioner, stripping away every civilized pretense until only the raw biological imperative remained, humming beneath the frozen skin. This descent wasn't a riot. It was a chillingly quiet reorganization of society purely on thermodynamic efficiency. The villages hadn't erupted in fire and screams of classic breakdown. They had simply gone dark, extinguishing the small, fragile lamps of their collective conscience one by one, leaving behind only the echoing emptiness of grim necessity and the smell of fear. And from this darkness, a new predator emerged, far more calculated and terrifying than the desperate lone wolf. The Compagnie Silenciose, the silent companies. These were not bandit gangs of old, driven by greed for gold or jewels. They were cold, disciplined cells, driven solely by the scientific requirement of survival. Fat, fuel, and functional, intact shelter. They moved like phantoms carved from the very snowdrifts, their faces obscured by frozen leather masks, their eyes devoid of recognition or mercy. Their raids were surgical, hitting the few remaining fortified cellars where families still clung to their last reserves of dried meat, preserved cheese, or, most critically, precious olive oil, which was now worth more than a Florentine florin itself in the cruel economy of the blizzard. The chilling tragedy was that these marauders were often former neighbors, men who had shared wine and bread just months prior, now transformed into relentless mechanical entities, obeying only the brutal, dehumanizing logic of survival kinetics. They had successfully suppressed the human capacity for empathy. The crisis was no longer primarily about food scarcity. That was a grim, accepted reality. The true, immediate battle now raged over thermal mass. Every piece of wood, every splinter of discarded furniture, every forgotten bale of straw became a finite, essential step toward avoiding the final, irreversible descent into lethal hypothermia. Villages began to systematically cannibalize their own historical structure. The unused church pews were the first to go, followed by the ornate timber frames of the wealthier, vacated houses. And then, most heartbreakingly, the irreplaceable looms and agricultural tools that defined their ancient crafts and generational identities. The heavy air became thick, not just with the acrid scent of smoke, but with the despairing odor of burning history, the methodical destruction of centuries of cultural artifacts sacrificed purely for the fleeting, agonizingly short warmth of an hour or two. Imagine the terrifying sound of a century-old, intricately carved olive press being smashed apart, piece by piece, to feed a meager, sputtering flame. The isolation was now absolute and terrifyingly complete. The crucial mountain passes were sealed by monumental drifts, walls of ice that dwarfed any human effort to breach them, like the world itself was closing its heavy, icy fist around the Apennines. Messengers who attempted the perilous journey down to the distant lowland cities to implore the doges or the papal states for desperate aid simply vanished without trace. They didn't even freeze into identifiable statues of ice. They were swallowed whole by the overwhelming, unforgiving indifference of the mountain, an ecosystem that rejected human intrusion with a final, fatal determination. The only sound that remained was the incessant, grinding, soul-crushing roar of the wind, a sound that obliterated even the most resilient possibility of hope. Rumors circulated among the desperate, huddled survivors that the lowlands themselves had either forgotten the Apennines existed, or perhaps, in a more chilling and calculated twist, they knew exactly what was happening in the peaks and chose to let the relentless, cleansing fire of the cold do its necessary, terrifying work. A new malady began to spread, not of the body, but of the mind, which the survivors grimly termed the crying sickness. It afflicted those who had lost too much, too quickly, those whose minds had simply overloaded from the sustained trauma. They wouldn't scream, fight, or riot. They would simply begin to weep, softly, uncontrollably, sometimes for days on end, until the sheer liquid exhaustion of their sorrow finally pulled them down into the endless, dark sleep. It was the sound of complete, utter psychic surrender, a realization that the monumental effort required to draw the next frozen breath far outweighed the pitiful reward of continuing to exist. The crying sickness was highly contagious, not through physical touch, but through devastating observation. Watching a neighbor succumb to the liquid despair was often enough to trigger the same crushing wave of nihilism in the observer. This quiet, internalized despair proved far more dangerous to the remaining social structure than any open violence, because it systematically drained the collective will to resist the inevitable, turning pockets of resistance into pools of inertia. But as resources dwindled to nothing, and the surviving population contracted into tight, fearful knots around their sputtering, precious fires, they noticed something far worse than the marauders' calculated raids. They realized, with a rising existential horror, that they were being meticulously watched, not by wolves, and not merely by men, but by the mountain itself, or something inherent within it. The survivors began to report impossibly large, unnatural silhouettes shifting high above the exposed crystalline ridges, shapes that seemed to defy the known physics of the terrain, moving with an eerie, non-human deliberation against the cold, moonlit snowscape. These were not necessarily malicious entities seeking to kill, but the sickening realization they were under cold, constant surveillance, that their slow, painful death was being meticulously observed and catalogued by something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent, added a final, unbearable layer of existential dread. It felt conclusive. When pitted against the absolute void, the human spirit was not indomitable. It was merely brittle, shattering into sharp, dangerous shards that could wound anyone who dared to get close. And now those dangerous, fragile shards were being counted and assessed by the dark watchers above.